So it's only been 2 years since the original Danish version of the film Speak No Evil came out, which, by the way, I've seen the film, I reviewed it on this very channel, but here we are 2 years later and we have the American remake of the film, which has a pretty good cast, but the question is this film any good? Is it possibly better than the original, and is it worth checking out? Well, we'll be discussing that and much more in today's spoiler-free review of 2024's Speak No Evil. But first, comment below. Let's talk about your thoughts about this movie. Number one, have you seen the original? And if so, were you excited or disappointed when you heard they were making a remake so soon after the original? But more importantly, once you've seen the American version of this film, let's talk about what you liked, what you didn't like, and which version do you personally prefer? Let's talk about it all in the comments below. This movie shows a dream holiday that turns into a living nightmare when an American couple and their daughter spend the weekend at a British family's country estate. So I'll be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan when I heard they were making an American remake of this film, which, by the way, speaking of the original film, again, I did the review on it. You can check it out. It has its flaws, the original, but I enjoyed that movie. But with all that being said, I wasn't that excited for the remake, but then they announced the cast. You know, James McAvoy, who I'm a big fan of, Mackenzie Davis, I'm a big fan of. So I said to myself, I'm going to give it a chance. So with all that being said, when it comes to this review, I think it's going to be inherently, I'm not doing it on purpose, but I will make some comparisons to the original, to this one, but I will do my best to focus on reviewing this film on its own merits. And then again, sharing what I liked about the film, what I didn't like, and also talking about some changes without giving too much away. So with all that being said, let's get into my thoughts here. First and foremost, I will say tonally, this version is very different in the fact that they are definitely leaning more into the comedic awkwardness of this situation. As I'll share later, some of the more hilarious moments worked and some didn't work, but I will say the way it's conveyed and how the actors like James McAvoy and Mackenzie Davis play into it really worked for me at points in this movie. Something that the original as well as this new one does a good job at is it shows how uncomfortable these characters are and really allows the audience to have fun with this situation way more in this one they do in the original. Which, speaking of the experience for the audience, I got to talk about my theatrical experience right quick. This was a half critic and general audience screening, and I gotta say, most of the people in my theater were having a good time. Like, regardless of what my final thoughts of the film is, I will say I think this is a crowd pleaser. Like, this is a Blumhouse movie, which we know that their batting average is not that great if you ask me, but when they hit, and this is a crowd pleaser, man. Like, this is one of those films that is the interacting with the crowd, and it's not annoying because I think horror films lends itself for like an audience to engage with the material more so than like a drama or what have you. So it is one of those films where the audience is like, don't do that, why are you going back, why aren't they leaving? Like, it's a fun engagement, and I think for me it enhances the experience. So again, regardless if I love this film, like this film, or hated it, it is a theatrical experience that I think you all will enjoy if you are interested in this film. And if you were a fan of the original, this is much more of a crowd pleaser than the original was. But going back to the comedy of it all, I just wasn't expecting this film to be as funny or to lean so much into the comedy. And while again, it didn't all necessarily work for me, I did find some good, well-placed moments of comedy throughout this film. Now, also comparing this to the original, I will say I like how the film plays on the social norms and values and how masculinity is played out in this film is really interesting. I thought the subject of having our main good couple playing on their relationship and their insecurities played a really big part into the couple's story and how it plays to their level of disconnect and how they're not on the same page. But for me, the two best things about this movie are the performances by our two leads, starting off with Mackenzie Davis, who at this point of her career, I've seen most of her work, whether it's in film or television. I've yet to see a bad performance. Like, I think she's just such a interesting looking actress, number one, like her stature and just like what she's able to convey with emotion. So I think she's a fantastic actor, and I like what she brings into the horror genre, and in particularly in this film, because the way that she plays into the discomfort that's going on, her reactions are really well timed, and she kicks it in gear when needed. Because I tell you what, as we'll talk about later, her husband was useless as is in the original, but I really like Mackenzie Davis. She really conveys a lot. She really steps into action when needed upon, and I thought she was fantastic. And without her, this film doesn't really work as well. But also going back to the original, not that the wife didn't have a lot to do, but I think that they definitely made it a point to make the wife in this version of the film have more to do and be more in the forefront, which again, Mackenzie Davis like fully captures what's needed to be conveyed with her character really well. But speaking of Mackenzie Davis, the other element that really worked in this film, and I think is the best part of this movie, is the performance by James McAvoy. Such a big fan of his, and you can just tell he's having an absolute blast in this role. I don't want to say it's on the same level of Split, which I think is his personal best performance of his career. Like, I love Split, I love The Beast, and everything he has to do in that film. But I will say, comparing those two performances, this performance that we see from James McAvoy, he has different shades of his character, right? He can be charming at points, he can be funny, entertaining, but he can also push your buttons. He can also intentionally make you uncomfortable. He's very abrasive, he's very aggressive, and James plays all those things perfectly. And he is just, this to me is just more proof that we need to see him be in more horror movies, more comedies, more dramas, more everything. Like, James is such a fantastic actor. He's great in this film, and he is just someone that when you walk out the theater, again, regardless of how I felt about this film, I said to myself, James McAvoy is just excellent. The last thing I want to mention before getting to my criticisms, this to me is a perfect example of how differently international films are handled and how American films are handled, and specifically speaking to the genre of horror. I personally prefer international horror films more than Americanized. And don't get me wrong, Michael Myers and all these slashers is my favorite genre. I love my American horror films, but horror internationally is just more bleak and disturbing. And this isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but this version of the film is definitely an American version of the movie, because I felt like they definitely made a lot of drastic changes to this film, especially with the script and especially the ending that we'll talk about without spoiling anything. And I also feel like it was more accessible and had more of a positive impact on how you're going to feel walking out of this movie. Like, I can just see a Hollywood executive like taking on the script and saying, we're going to make an American version of it, but I can also see them having like a red pen and being like, yep, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to make this a lot more, like I said, positive on how they handle. Like, this film is not as disturbing or as bleak as the original. So again, not a good thing, not a bad thing, just something I wanted to bring up. But now getting into the bad and transitioning to my criticisms here, I gotta say right off the bat, I personally didn't like the setup in this film by how things kind of build things up and how we arrive to certain events. Like, once the film gets to the house, that's when the film peaks and really gets interesting. But all the setups to me was just handled better in the original. Like, it made more sense why that couple would want to meet these strangers that they just met just a couple days ago. With this film, it kind of rushed through the development and the bond that the couples have, and I really didn't buy into like, oh yeah, they would want to just go to these strangers' house. Like, I wish the film would have did a better job of putting an emphasis on how comfortable they felt meeting these strangers who they don't know if they're good or evil. Now, I gotta mention, one of my biggest criticisms while watching this film was the movie lacked a lot of subtlety. Like, one of the things I like about the original is how it executed the idea of politeness and the cultural differences of our couple was just handled better. Like, you can kind of understand why that couple in the original wasn't leaving the situation. But when it comes to this movie, our couple, it was just too over the top. It was just like so overt, too on the nose, and you had to cut off the logical part of your brain a lot more in this version versus the Danish version. Like, it was just like, why are you doing this? In the way that the film writes its characters in the situation, again, the logic part of your brain has to be cut off, and it's just like you definitely have to suspend your disbelief a lot more in this version than you did in an original version. Now, another thing that definitely bothered me while watching this film, while speaking on the overtness or the lack of nuance, I don't want to use the word fourth wall breaking, but this movie to me, like I mentioned, it leans heavily into the comedy. Like, this to me is a dark comedy thriller more than like a horror thriller. So with that being said, there were just moments to me, again, speaking to the lack of subtlety, there were moments where like the scene plays out and it's very uncomfortable, it's very awkward, but then it made it like the reaction sometimes, the way it was set up and staged, and it was almost like the characters were looking at the audience like, this is messed up, right? Like, this is awkward. Like, what would you do in this situation? And again, it's not subtle. It's almost like the situation when you have someone that says something funny or they acknowledge something funny and then they look at you and say, that's funny, right? Like, you get why it's funny. You're like, yeah, I get why it's funny. You don't have to tell me why it's funny. You cut away all the tension, cut away the awkwardness of it when you acknowledge it. And I feel like this film just had too many times where they were like very aware that something that they were putting on screen was awkward, and they're just like, hey, this is weird, right? And it's just like, it took me out of the film quite a few times. Now, going back to that last point, I personally found the original, and I prefer the original when it came to the situational horror or the discomfort horror, where this film, again, it's situational dark comedy. And I know for some people that will watch this film, they're going to feel as though that the handoff from the first 2 acts of this movie is definitely a dark comedy, and then it transitions into like a survival film. And I know for some people that's going to work as far as like one genre to the next, but I didn't feel like it blended well. Like, I didn't feel like the handoff from like a comedy to a horror wasn't handled that well or executed that well, in my opinion, because what I felt when watching this film, the tension was undercut by the way the film handled its tone. When we get to a certain point in this film, it's like, this isn't your first rodeo. Why are you so goofy and clumsy and messy? Like, it's just a tonal thing with me in this film that, again, it's fun, it's entertaining, but when the film's like, let's get serious, it's like, I can't get serious when you're goofing around for an hour and a half and now you want me to switch into like a survival movie. It just didn't work for me personally with the tonal shift. Now, earlier I gave praise to the performances of James McAvoy and Mackenzie Davis, who are just phenomenal in this movie, but I wish that their partners were more involved and were more interesting. I'm referring to Ashley Franciosi, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. She's a great actress. She was in a Jennifer Kent film called The Nightingale that came out several years ago. Very great movie, but very triggering, very disturbing. But she's in this movie, and Scoot McNairy, 2 great actors. I like them, but they are not that great in this movie. Like, they're just very one note, very one dimensional. They don't have that much to do. But I want to talk about Scoot, who, like I said before, I say what I'm going to say now, he's a good actor. I like him a lot. But when it comes to this film, he plays the husband, and I will say, just to kind of go back on the merits of this film being its own thing, but being a remake of the original, both films, the husbands in both films are useless. They do not have primal instinct, I'll just say that. But for some reason, Scoot in this movie was worse in certain elements. I won't give too much away. There's certain elements that I thought Scoot did better as a husband than what the husband, Bjorn, I think his name was, in the original. But with this movie, Scoot just wasn't working for me. I know the film is meant to piss you off for why the couple isn't leaving, why the husband is suggesting certain things, but this film lacked the decision making. It was just horrible at points for me, the choices that was made by the husband, because he was bitch made in my opinion. But then the way that the film kind of plays on it, again, I felt that the original did a better job of having nuance and depth of like the relationships and the couples and the individual characters on why they would stay, why they would leave. I didn't really buy into a relationship, number one. Like, I didn't really think that Mackenzie and Scoot had much of a chemistry. Like, I didn't buy them as husband and wife and them having a kid. Scoot, again, great actor, but his performance was the weakest, in my opinion, of the entire cast. And last but not least, without spoilers, I do want to touch on the ending of the film. Now, I do think that both films' endings, which are vastly different, one's darker, bleaker, the other one's a little bit more, I don't want to say lighthearted, but it's a little bit more optimistic with this ending. I will say that I think both endings work for the tones that each film is going for. And when it comes to the tone that this film is going for, with everything being heightened and everything being a little bit over the top, it works for what they were going for. And I will say, compared to the original, I know that there was probably a note of how to change something at the end to make it more of a crowd pleaser, especially with a certain character. I didn't really touch on the young children in this film. They're fine, but there is a moment at the end that one of the kids get a pretty big crowd pleasing moment, and it's kind of an homage to the original, but handled in a different way. And when you see the film, and if you've seen the original, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I just will say, the ending, I think, works for this film, again, based on the tone they were going for and based on how they are making it more of a entertaining, comedic, dark comedy. So the ending of this film is unique, and I'm really excited to see what you all think about it. But also, just going back to what I like about the original ending, it's way darker, it's way more disturbing, and it just has more gravitas. And I prefer that ending for that film between the two, because I prefer the tone of the original than I did this one here. And one more thing that I'll say about the ending without giving too much away. there's a line that's delivered in both endings, and I just felt that the line delivery and how it was meant to be perceived was just way darker in the original, where this one was just like, again, the comedic moments undercuts the tension a lot for me in this film. But those are my pros, those are my cons. Before I give you all my overall thoughts, I want to take this time to thank you all for making it to this point in the video. If you've enjoyed yourself so far, make sure you're hitting the thumbs up, sharing this video, leaving your thoughts in the comments, but also consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel. Overall, like the original, Speak No Evil is an interesting experience that highlights the social awkwardness and uncomfortableness when you allow people to cross your boundaries without stopping them. Now, this remake doesn't leave you with such a sickening feeling as the original did, but instead it offers a more accessible and far more crowd-pleasing, entertaining experience. Mackenzie Davis and James McAvoy are why you go see this film, especially seeing James absolutely nail his character's actions throughout, and you can just tell he's loving every single second of playing this role. Now, even though I wasn't bought into the creative decisions of leaning more into the comedy with this film, which again took away from the more tense-filled scenes, but compared to some recent Blumhouse movies, this is far more superior in quality, and as far as modern remakes goes, this film isn't terrible. With that, I'm going to give the American version of Speak No Evil a 3 out of 5. So again, I would say seeing this in theaters definitely enhances the experience. Like, this is a fun time in the theaters. Like, again, even if this is a fine movie, I prefer the original. I just like the tone of the original. I think it balances its tone better, and it's far more disturbing, and it is a horror movie where this is a thriller. But again, this is a good time in the theater, so that's why I gave it that 3 out of 5. And again, I prefer the original, but now it's your turn to let me know what you think of this film. If you haven't seen the original, do you want to go back and see the original, just kind of compare the two? Or if you were like me and saw the original, which one do you prefer? And let's just talk about it all in the comments. The good, the bad, the ugly. Let's talk in the comments below. Thank you again for watching today's video. Make sure to check out all my recent reviews I have on the channel. By the time this video is up, I will be gearing up for the Fantastic Fest. We got the Penguin, a lot of things to look forward to. So again, subscribe to the channel. Thank you again. You all are awesome. Stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.